She was a weapon disguised as a comfort girl, sent with hidden poison to assassinate the American officers she was taught were monsters. Captured in a failed ambush, she braced herself for a fate worse than death. But what she received instead was an act of kindness so profound it would dismantle her entire reality and force her to question everything she was willing to die for. Lien had been trained to expect a monster, a beast in the shape of a man who would tear her apart. So when the towering American soldier captured her, pressing her face into the mud, she braced for the inevitable horror her commissars had described in sickening detail. But what came next was not brutality. It was a canteen of water pressed to her lips and a voice, impossibly young, saying in broken Vietnamese, "Water. Drink." This single act of kindness was more disorienting than any violence. It was the first crack in the foundation of her reality, the beginning of the demolition of everything she believed to be true. Just hours earlier, in the shadows of the banyan trees, she was a different person entirely. The humid jungle air, thick with the scent of jasmine and gunpowder, clung to her skin as she recited the party's catechism in her mind. The Americans were beasts in the shape of men, driven by monstrous appetites. Tonight, she and her sisters would be the beautiful, poisoned bait. The shadows under the great banyan trees deepened as the sun bled out behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that felt like a sacrilege against the grim business of the evening. For 3 years, Lien's world had been stripped of such colors, repainted in the stark black and white of revolutionary struggle. White was the purity of their cause, the coming triumph of a unified Vietnam. Black was the enemy, the foreign invaders from across the sea, whose evil was as absolute and bottomless as a moonless night. She and the 5 other girls in her squad, Unit 73 of the Provincial Women's Liberation Front, were the living embodiment of this struggle. They were not soldiers in the way the men were, carrying rifles and mortars. They were a different kind of weapon, one forged in the crucible of loss and honed by the relentless indoctrination of the political commissars. Their training had been exhaustive. They learned to move silently, to kill with a sliver of bamboo, to endure pain without sound. But their primary instruction was in the art of deception. They were taught to weaponize their youth, their apparent vulnerability, their femininity. They were to be the lotus flowers blooming on the surface of a poisoned pond, beautiful and deadly. The commissar, a stern man named Chien, whose face seemed carved from hardwood, had drilled the stories into them until they replaced memory. He spoke of American soldiers who were not men but devils, their blood corrupted by capitalism and greed. He described in graphic, sickening detail what they did to captured women, tales that became a litany of horror whispered in their barracks at night. They were told of villages burned not for strategic purpose, but for sport, of women taken as playthings and discarded like broken dolls. Lien's own hatred needed little stoking. She carried the memory of her village, a peaceful fishing hamlet on the coast, turned to ash and splintered wood by a bombing raid 2 years prior. She remembered the whine of the jets, the earth-shattering explosions, and the silence that followed, a silence that swallowed the voices of her mother and younger brother. Commissar Chien had given a name to the faceless pilots in the sky. He called them Americans. And with that, her grief was forged into the spearpoint of her resolve. Their mission tonight was both simple and suicidal. They were to allow themselves to be discovered near the perimeter of Fire Support Base Eagle, a notorious American outpost perched on Hill 312. Dressed as peasants fleeing a Viet Cong attack, their story was that they were seeking sanctuary. They were to appear terrified, helpless, and grateful. Once inside, their true objective would begin. Each girl carried a tiny vial of potent, fast-acting poison derived from the skin of the crate snake, concealed in a hollowed-out bamboo chopstick. Their targets were the American officers. Their method was to be an invitation, an offering of comfort that would end in a silent, agonizing death. It was a mission from which none of them expected to return, but they were true believers. To be captured was a fate they were all ordered to avoid at any cost, each girl carrying a single cyanide capsule for that purpose. It was a more merciful end than the one promised by the commissar. They moved through the twilight, their bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. Lien's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and exhilaration. She clutched the small basket of woven reeds that was her only prop, its contents a few pitiful vegetables to complete her disguise. Mai, the youngest of the group at only 16, stumbled on a root, and Lian caught her arm, steadying her. In the dim light, she saw the girl's eyes, wide with a terror that was not entirely feigned. Lian gave her a firm, reassuring nod, echoing the commissar's words in a whisper, "For a unified homeland." Mai nodded back, her lips a thin, pale line. They were close now. Through the dense curtain of foliage, they could see the ugly gash of the fire base, a wound of red clay and concertina wire carved into the green flesh of the jungle. The air grew heavy with the alien smells of diesel fuel, chewing tobacco, and cooking meat. It was the smell of the beast in its lair. The plan was for Lean to create the initial diversion, to step out into the clearing first and draw the attention of the perimeter guards. She took a deep breath, pictured her mother's face, and pushed aside a large fern leaf. The clearing was a churned field of mud, pockmarked with craters and littered with the detritus of war-spent shell casings, ration tins, sandbags. In the distance, a pair of soldiers stood silhouetted in a watchtower. Lien took a step forward, then another, preparing to let out a cry for help. Before she could open her mouth, the world erupted. A blinding white light pinned her in place, followed by a cacophony of shouts in the harsh, guttural language of the enemy. It wasn't a spotlight from the tower. It was from the jungle itself, to their flank, an ambush. Automatic weapon fire tore through the trees, not the familiar, throatier chatter of her comrades' AK-47s, but the terrifyingly rapid roar of the M16, a sound like tearing fabric that was completely alien to her ears. The girls scattered, their training screaming at them to find cover, but there was nowhere to go. Mai went down with a silent gasp, a dark stain spreading across her simple black pajamas. Another girl screamed, a sharp, piercing sound cut short. Lian dove behind a rotted log as bullets ripped through the wood, showering her with splinters. Her mind, once so clear in its purpose, was a maelstrom of confusion. How did they know? The mission was compromised. Her training took over: escape, evade, survive, or if not, then the final option. Her fingers fumbled for the small tooth she was meant to bite down on. But before she could find it, a heavy weight slammed into her, knocking the air from her lungs. A towering figure in green, his face a smear of camouflage paint, pressed her into the mud. She fought back, a feral snarl ripping from her throat, her nails clawing for his eyes. He was immensely strong, effortlessly pinning her arms. This was it. The moment the commissar had described. The beginning of the end. She twisted her head, trying to bite, to spit, to do anything but submit. The soldier grunted, and then another was there, pulling her hands behind her back, binding her wrists with a strip of rough plastic that cut into her skin. They hauled her to her feet. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw two of her other sisters, similarly captured, their faces pale with shock. Mai and the others were gone, vanished into the violent chaos. As they were pushed forward toward the enemy's wire, Lian's mind was a single repeating cry of despair. She had failed the mission. She had failed her family. And now she was in the hands of the monsters. She braced herself for the inevitable brutality, for the prelude to the nightmare her commissars had so vividly described. But as she was forced through the gate, into the brightly lit heart of the enemy camp, the first blow never landed. As rough hands bound her wrists with plastic cuffs, Lian closed her eyes and waited for the violation to begin. Instead, the canteen was pressed to her lips. The water tasted of metal and purification tablets, but it was the most profound relief she had ever known. When she finished, she opened her eyes. The American soldier holding it was a boy no older than she was, his face covered in freckles and a thin sheen of sweat. He wasn't looking at her with the lustful, predatory gaze she had been trained to expect. He was looking at her with a mixture of fear and pity. The commissar's teachings had been a fortress, protecting her from doubt, fueling her with righteous hate. Now, a single act of simple, human decency had breached the walls. She and the other two surviving girls, Hien and An, were made to sit on the damp ground, their backs against a wall of sandbags. A dozen American soldiers formed a loose, wary circle around them. They carried their rifles casually, but their eyes were constantly moving, scanning the dark perimeter. None of them spoke to the girls. None of them leered or made crude gestures. They mostly ignored them, their attention focused on the radio operator who was speaking in low, urgent tones. Leon's mind struggled to process the scene. Where were the monsters? These soldiers were young, tired, and nervous. They chewed gum and tobacco, their boyish faces streaked with dirt. They looked less like the demonic figures from propaganda posters and more like the farm boys from the next province over. A new figure approached, older than the rest, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeves. He knelt in front of Leon, his movements slow and deliberate. He pointed to a gash on her forearm where a splinter from the log had torn the skin. Before she could react, he had a medical kit open. The wipe wasn't just sterile, it was cold, and the chemical smell of the antiseptic was sharp, a clean scent in a world of mud and decay. She flinched, expecting a trick, a moment of pain. But his fingers, though calloused, were steady. She watched his knuckles, the fine blonde hairs on his arms, details that made the monster infuriatingly human. He placed a clean white bandage over the cut and secured it with tape. He performed the same service for Hien, who had a cut on her cheek. Throughout the entire process, he did not speak a word. He simply treated their injuries as a matter of routine, the same way a carpenter might fix a broken chair. Propaganda insisted they were worthless, subhuman, objects for defilement. This man's actions insisted they were simply wounded people in need of care. She tried to rationalize it. This had to be a new form of psychological warfare, a way to soften them up, to make them lower their guard before the real horrors began. The commissar had warned them that the Americans were cunning. This must be that cunning in action. She held on to that thought, a lifeline in a rising sea of confusion. But the evidence of her own senses continued to contradict the dogma. They were given food, a dense, sweet bar of chocolate from a soldier's ration pack. She held it, her paranoia screaming that it was poisoned. She carefully broke it in half, inspecting the rich, dark interior before her hunger finally won. Leon had never tasted anything like it. It was a flavor from another world, a world of impossible abundance. She watched the Americans. They shared cigarettes, complained about the mud, spoke in low tones about someone back home named Jody. They were not the one-dimensional caricatures from her indoctrination. They were complex individuals, and their mundane humanity was more terrifying to her ideology than any overt act of cruelty would have been. Lien's entire worldview is beginning to crack. If you want to follow this incredible journey of psychological transformation to its conclusion, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The sky began to pale in the east when the sound started, a low, rhythmic thumping that grew steadily louder. A helicopter. A new wave of fear washed over Lien. She had seen what these machines could do. They were dragons of metal and fury that rained death from the sky. The machine, a UH-1 Huey, landed in a whirlwind of dust and deafening noise. The girls were led to it, their heads bowed against the rotor wash. The inside of the helicopter was a maze of wires, pipes, and canvas seats. They were buckled in by a crew chief whose face was hidden behind a dark visor. As the helicopter lifted off, the ground falling away with a sickening lurch, the vibration of the metal floor plates buzzed through her entire body. Lien saw the fire base shrink below her. It looked like a child's toy, a fragile collection of huts and trenches carved into a vast, indifferent jungle. For the first time, she was seeing the war from the enemy's perspective, a god's-eye view that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The scale of it all was overwhelming. The jungle stretched to the horizon, an endless ocean of green. Her mission, which had felt like the center of the universe just hours before, now seemed like a tiny, insignificant gesture. The flight was short. They landed at a much larger base, a sprawling city of tents, wooden buildings, and airstrips. This was Da Nang Air Base, a name spoken in fearful whispers back in her village. It was the heart of the American war machine in their region. The efficiency and scale of the place were incomprehensible. Trucks and jeeps moved in orderly lines. Men in different uniforms marched in formation. Aircraft took off and landed with a relentless, deafening rhythm. It was a display of organizational power that dwarfed anything she had ever imagined. This was not the work of brutish thugs. It was the work of a highly advanced, disciplined power. As she was led from the helicopter, her feet touching the hot tarmac, the sheer, overwhelming reality of American capacity was a physical blow. Her hatred had been a simple, pure thing aimed at a caricature. But the enemy was not a caricature. The enemy was a logistical and industrial giant, and its soldiers were not monsters, but men. She was a prisoner, stripped of her mission and her weapon, but she was beginning to realize that the most formidable weapon she had ever faced was not a rifle or a bomb. It was the quiet, undeniable evidence of her own eyes. Lien believed her conditioning was unbreakable. She was about to discover that the most effective weapon against propaganda wasn't torture, but a simple, undeniable photograph. The interrogation tent was suffocatingly hot, smelling of canvas and stale coffee, but there was no rack, no bamboo splinters under the fingernails. There was only a tired-looking officer with a Vietnamese interpreter, and a question that was more disarming than any threat. "Tell me about your village." Lien remained silent, her eyes fixed on a point on the tent wall. She had been separated from Hien and An and brought to this tent an hour ago. She had spent that time preparing for pain, reciting the names of heroes who had died under torture without revealing a single secret. She would be worthy of their sacrifice. But the anticipated violence never came. The officer, a captain with weary eyes and a slumped posture, offered her a cigarette, which she refused. He poured himself a cup of coffee from a thermos and gestured to the interpreter. The interpreter was the most unsettling part of the equation. He was Vietnamese, but his accent was strange, and his clothes were American. He introduced himself as Sergeant Tran. He looked at her, not with the contempt of a traitor, but with a sad, knowing expression that unnerved her more than any threat. "The captain wants to know about your home," Sergeant Tran said, his voice soft. "He is not asking about unit numbers or infiltration routes. He is asking what you grew up eating. He is asking if you fished in the river or worked in the paddies." The questions were designed to disarm, to make her human in their eyes and perhaps in her own. She resisted, her mind a fortress of silence. "The revolution will triumph over the American invaders," she spat, the words a rehearsed slogan. "Your capitalist machine will be ground into the dust of our homeland." Sergeant Tran simply translated, his expression unchanging. The captain sighed and took a sip of his coffee. He spoke to Sergeant Tran in English, his voice a low rumble. "He says he has your file," Tran translated. "He knows your name is Nguyen Thi Lien. He knows your village was An Khu. He knows it was destroyed on May 12, 1967. The specific details were a shock. They knew her name. They knew the date her world had ended. He wants to show you something." The captain slid a glossy black and white photograph across the simple wooden table. Lien's eyes were drawn to it against her will. It was an aerial reconnaissance photo. She could clearly see the layout of her village, as it once was, the neat rows of houses, the curve of the river, the large banyan tree in the center of the square. Another photo was placed next to it. It showed the same village, but this time it was a ruin, a collection of craters and blackened foundations. Her breath caught in her throat. The captain then produced a third document, a report filled with maps and official text. "This is an after-action report from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam," Sergeant Tran said, his voice flat, as if reading a weather forecast. "It documents a mortar strike against suspected Viet Cong positions on that date. It details a targeting error. The rounds fell short. They landed on An Cu village." He paused, letting the words sink in. The American air wing in this sector recorded no sorties that day. The planes that destroyed your village were not American. They were your allies in the South. It was a mistake. Lien stared at the documents, her world tilting on its axis. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A trick to break her loyalty. "You lie," she spat, the words tasting like ash. "The commissar told us. Everyone knows it was the Americans." Sergeant Tran's expression didn't change. "The commissar told you what you needed to hear to fight. We are telling you what the records show. Which story do you think is more likely to be the truth? The one told by the man who handed you poison, or the one documented here in the records of your own countrymen?" She wanted to scream, to rage, to denounce him as a traitor and a liar. But the calm, factual nature of the presentation, the cold, bureaucratic evidence on the table, was like water seeping into the cracks of her certainty. She had no counter-argument, only the repeated dogma of her indoctrination. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. What if the foundation of her all-consuming hatred was a lie? What would that make her? What would that make her sacrifice? The interrogation continued, not with threats, but with a slow, relentless dismantling of her worldview. They showed her photographs of Viet Cong atrocities, village elders executed, school teachers assassinated. They played her a recording of a captured commissar admitting to fabricating stories of American brutality to motivate his troops. Each piece of evidence was another stone removed from the wall of her convictions. The power of a single photograph to dismantle a lifetime of lies is immense. If you know someone who appreciates stories that reveal the hidden complexities of conflict, share this video with them. After what felt like an eternity, she was led out of the tent, blinking in the harsh afternoon Sunday. She was taken to a larger holding area, a simple compound fenced with concertina wire. Inside, there were dozens of other female captives. She expected to find a spirit of defiant camaraderie. Instead, she found an atmosphere of listless resignation. The women sat in small groups, their faces blank. The fire of revolution had been extinguished, replaced by a weary emptiness. Over the next few days, Lian watched the life of the base unfold. She saw soldiers getting mail from home, their faces lighting up as they read letters and looked at photographs. She saw them play vigorous games of basketball, their shouts and laughter echoing across the compound. She saw a young soldier tenderly caring for a stray puppy he had adopted, sharing his rations with the scruffy animal. Each of these moments was a small, quiet argument against the commissar's teachings. Monsters did not weep over letters from their mothers. Devils did not adopt stray dogs. The Americans were not a monolithic entity of pure evil. They were flawed, homesick, and dangerously powerful young men, caught in a war they seemed to understand no better than she did. The sheer waste of it all was staggering. She saw mechanics discard entire engine parts that could have been repaired. She saw cooks throwing away vast quantities of uneaten food, more than her entire village would see in a week. This casual, thoughtless abundance was another form of power, a testament to a nation so wealthy it could afford to be wasteful even at war. It spoke of a power that could not be defeated by snake poison and bamboo spears. It was the power of a society that could create and discard on a scale she could barely comprehend. Her cause, which had seemed so righteous and inevitable, now felt small and futile, a desperate struggle against an invincible tide. The commissar had promised victory. The evidence of her eyes promised only a long, grinding defeat. She sat by the wire fence, watching the endless activity of the base, and felt the last vestiges of her hatred begin to crumble, not in a fiery explosion, but in a slow, quiet, and agonizing dissolution. Day after day, the humanity of her captors chipped away at her hatred, but her transformation was not yet complete. It would take the thunder of an attack from her own side to forge her final choice. The scream of incoming mortars ripped through the night, a familiar sound of righteous fury. But as the earth shook and shrapnel tore through the air, her first instinct was not to celebrate the attack. It was to look for the young medic who had given her water. The attack was sudden and brutal. The first rounds landed near the ammunition dump, a series of thunderous explosions that lit up the entire base in a terrifying, flickering orange light. Sirens blared as soldiers scrambled from their barracks, shouting and firing into the darkness. Lian and the other women in the holding pen huddled together, raw instinct taking over. For a moment, a flicker of her old self returned. This was the hand of the revolution, reaching into the enemy's heart to strike a blow. She should feel pride, she should feel vindicated, but she felt nothing of the sort. All she felt was a cold, paralyzing fear. The explosions were not abstract symbols of resistance, they were terrifyingly real, shaking the very ground beneath her. She saw figures running through the strobing light, some falling. The detached, ideological view of war had been replaced by the visceral, personal horror of it. The wire fence of their compound was torn open by a nearby blast, and the American guards who had been watching them were gone, presumably joining the defense of the perimeter. The women were untended, ignored in the larger chaos. Hien grabbed Lian's arm, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. "We can escape," she hissed. "This is our chance." A few months ago, Lian would have been the first one through the gap, melting back into the jungle that was her home. It was her duty, but she hesitated. Her eyes scanned the chaotic scene, not for an escape route, but for a familiar face. She saw him then, the medic. The young soldier with the freckles who had given her the first drink of water, who had tended to her arm. His name, she had learned by listening to the others, was Dennis. He was running toward a wounded soldier who was down near the collapsed mess tent. Just as he reached the man, another mortar round landed with a deafening crash. Lian saw Dennis thrown through the air like a rag doll. He landed in a heap not 20 meters from the torn fence and did not move. The battle raged around him, a storm of tracer fire and explosions. No one was paying attention to him. He was just another body in the chaos. Hien was pulling at her arm again, urging her toward the jungle. "Lian, come on, we have to go now." Lin took a single instinctive step towards the freedom of the dark tree line, a lifetime of training compelling her to flee. But her feet felt rooted to the muddy ground. She stopped, turning her head back, her eyes locked on the fallen medic. Her mind was a battlefield. On one side was the commissar, her training, her duty to the cause, her hatred for the invaders. On the other was the memory of a canteen of water, a clean bandage, and a boy's frightened, pitying eyes. To leave him there to die felt like a betrayal of the small, fragile bridge of humanity that had been built between them. It was a bridge built of chocolate bars and clean bandages, of shy glances and unspoken understanding. It was a bridge she could not bring herself to burn. "Go," she told Hien, pushing her toward the opening. "I will follow." Hien gave her a confused look but didn't wait, scrambling through the wire and disappearing into the night. Lian was alone. She took a breath and ran, not toward the freedom of the jungle, but toward the fallen American. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite. Bullets snapped past her. She kept her head down, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached Dennis. He was conscious, but barely, his face pale in the flickering light. His leg was a mangled ruin, bleeding profusely. He looked up at her, his eyes unfocused, filled with pain and disbelief. He probably thought she had come to finish him off. Her training had taught her how to kill a man with a single, precise blow. It had also taught her how to apply a tourniquet. She ripped a strip of cloth from her own pajamas, found a piece of splintered wood, and wrapped it tightly around his thigh, twisting it until the bleeding slowed. It was a crude, desperate act, but it was the only thing she could do. The chaos began to subside as the American forces organized their counterattack. A soldier running past saw the strange tableau, the enemy prisoner tending to his wounded comrade. He raised his M16, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. Dennis, seeing the gun, managed to lift a weak hand. "No," he croaked. "She helped." The soldier hesitated, then lowered his rifle, shouting for other medics instead. As help arrived, they pushed Lian aside, their movements rough and efficient as they loaded Dennis onto a stretcher. For a moment, as they carried him away, his eyes met hers. There was no gratitude, no understanding. There was only pain and the profound, unbridgeable chasm of war. In a moment of chaos, Lian made a choice between ideology and humanity. What would you have done? We read every comment, so let us know your thoughts below. The attack was over. The fires were being put out, and the wounded were being gathered. Lian was roughly escorted back to the now secured holding pen. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was an anomaly, a contradiction that nobody knew how to handle. She had been given the perfect chance to escape, the dream of every captured soldier. She had not only refused it, but had risked her life to save one of the very enemies she had been sent to kill. As she sat alone in the quiet aftermath, the smell of blood and smoke filling the air, she knew with absolute certainty that her former life was over. She had betrayed her cause, and in doing so, had committed herself to a future she could not begin to imagine. In the quiet dawn after the battle, the soldier whose life she had saved approached her, not with suspicion, but with a steaming metal cup. The coffee was bitter, but as Lian held its warmth in her hands, she realized it was the first thing she had been given that she didn't believe was poison. His name was Corporal Evans, and he had been the one who had seen her drag Dennis to safety. He didn't speak Vietnamese, and she knew only a handful of English words, so they communicated in the universal language of gestures. He pointed to her, then to the medical tent where Dennis had been taken, and gave a thumbs up. "Thank you." It was a simple gesture, but it reconfigured her world. She was no longer an object of hate or a source of intelligence. She was a person who had made a choice, and that choice was being acknowledged. Later that day, Sergeant Tran came to see her. He brought a new set of clean gray clothes and a small bag with a toothbrush and a bar of soap. He sat with her for a long time, not asking questions, but simply talking. He told her about his family in California, about his younger sister who was attending university. He spoke of the complexities of the war, of his own divided loyalties as a Vietnamese American, fighting in the land of his ancestors. "What you did last night," he said finally, looking her directly in the eye, "it was not the act of a soldier, it was the act of a human being. It is very difficult to remain human in this place." On both sides, he told her that her status had changed. She was no longer considered a hostile combatant. She would be moved to a different facility, a refugee processing center near Bien Hoa, away from the front lines. Her future was not certain, but it would not be in a prison camp. This news was not the relief she might have expected. It was a confirmation of her isolation. She had no cause to return to. The Viet Cong would consider her a traitor for not escaping, and a coward for helping the enemy. She had no home to go back to. Her village was a ghost, and her family was dead. The Americans saw her as a strange anomaly, a momentary ally of convenience. She belonged nowhere. She was adrift on a sea of political and military forces she could not control, her only compass the confusing, painful truth she had discovered. The truth was that there were no monsters, only men. There were men who followed orders, men who were cruel, men who were kind, men who were frightened, and men who were brave. The simple black and white world of the commissar had been a lie, a comforting fiction to justify the killing. The real world was an unbearable, chaotic palette of grays. Her final days at the firebase were quiet. The soldiers treated her differently. They still watched her, but the suspicion was gone, replaced by a kind of awkward curiosity. They would leave her extra food or a magazine, small offerings of peace. She saw Dennis one last time, as he was being loaded onto a medevac helicopter bound for a hospital in Japan. His leg was heavily bandaged, but he was alive. He gave her a weak, morphine-lidded smile. It was a farewell. The journey to Bien Hoa was in the back of a canvas-covered truck. She watched the Vietnamese countryside roll by, a landscape of breathtaking beauty and heartbreaking sorrow. She saw farmers working in their paddies, children playing by the side of the road, villages that were still whole and untouched. It was the country she had been fighting for, but she no longer knew what that meant. Who was she fighting against? The Americans? The Southern government? The lies of her own leaders? The refugee center was a sprawling, chaotic city of tents and sorrow. It was filled with people like her, people who had lost everything, caught between the grinding gears of the war. But here, there was no ideology, only the raw, desperate struggle for survival. She was given a number, a cot, and a bowl of rice. She was anonymous again, but this time it was an anonymity born of loss, not of mission. She had been liberated from the ideological prison of her indoctrination, only to find herself in the real prison of the war's consequences. There was no glory here, no patriotic fervor. There was only the quiet daily work of staying alive. In the evenings, she would look up at the sky and think of her mother and brother. Before, their ghosts had been her fuel, their memory a weapon. Now, they were just a source of a deep, unending ache. They had died for a cause she now knew was built on a foundation of lies. Her sacrifice, her hatred, her mission, it had all been for nothing. Or perhaps it had been for something else entirely. It had been a journey through the heart of darkness that had, against all odds, led her to a fragile, flickering light of her own humanity. Her war was over, but as she looked out at the faces of the thousands of other displaced souls, she understood that the real struggle, the struggle to build a life from the ashes of a world of lies, was just beginning. Thank you for joining us on this journey. To continue exploring the hidden stories and complex truths of history, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Your viewership makes this work possible.